Good morning and welcome to week one of medical ethics. I hope you've had the opportunity to listen to the syllabus audio and have a general sense of what we're going to be doing this semester and an idea of the assignments, etc. Come to class when we have the on-site next week with any questions, or feel free to email me with any questions that you might have. But for now, we're just going to go over a general overview of what is medical ethics and some of the theories related to medical ethics. So, what is it? Medical ethics is a branch of moral philosophy and deals with conflicts in obligations or duties and their potential outcomes. It's the study of moral values and judgments as they apply to medicine. It's not an exact science because in certain situations, it can be difficult to know what's ethically correct. That's something that people struggle with all the time. What's the right thing to do? And who defines right? So those are some of the challenges because those ethical debates commonly arise. So we need to have a comprehensive knowledge of what medical ethics is and how it's important in deciding the best course of action. It deals with our choices, our decisions, and our actions, and it's based on the choices, duties, and obligations of a healthcare provider when we talk about medical ethics to determine what's in the best interest of the patient. It's a systematic approach towards applying the principles to decision making. Ethical theories are those general schools of thought regarding what rightness or the wrongness of a proposed action when choosing from a variety or a number of possible actions that could be taken. And these principles, or ethical principles, heavily govern the practice of healthcare. We have to practice under a set of general ethical principles when you're in a healthcare field. While it's easy to define ethics and principles under which healthcare is practiced, there are exceptions in all areas of the principles of clinical practice, and we'll talk about what the principles are a little bit later. But give you an example. There are times, confidentiality is one of the general principles of healthcare practice, but there may be times where a breach in confidentiality may arise. You have a patient who can't provide an informed consent or doesn't have the capacity to make a decision. Well, you kind of have to breach the confidentiality of that person and discuss the healthcare practice or healthcare situation with someone else, possibly in that person's family. If a person is in a permanently vegetative state, okay, you have to be able to breach the confidentiality aspect to provide the best care for that person because they don't have the ability to make decisions independently. So it all started, healthcare ethics started with the Hippocratic Oath, which was developed or attributed to Hippocrates in the 5th century BC. And that was kind of the start of other ancient civilization also developing their elaborate codes, which ethically guided a physician's work and defined the professional ethics for that group, which we've commonly we call professionalism. So the Hippocratic Oath is an oath historically taken by physicians. Some use today, some medical schools still use a version of the Hippocratic Oath, some do not. It's kind of more of a rite of passage in medical schools versus, having any necessarily repercussions as a result of violating the oath. So it's gone through a lot of different incarnations over the year. So it certainly is not the original one that is attributed to Hippocrates. But the original Hippocratic Oath had many of the principles that are still considered part of ethical practice today. For example, confidentiality was included in that original Hippocratic Oath. A statement about non-malfeasance. We'll talk about that in a second. As I said, it's gone through many, many different incarnations, um, including in other professions have also developed their own oaths. So there's, for example, there's an osteopathic doctor oath. The American Medical Association developed their own code of medical ethics, early or mid 1800s, that's been adopted. The original Hippocratic Oath, I think the most recent incarnation of that or revision of that was in the mid 60s, which many schools still use that version today. One of the important things, there's also this misconception that the phrase first do no harm is part of the Hippocratic Oath, and it's one of the most widely attributed or most widely known phrases of a medical oath, but it's actually not part of the Hippocratic Oath, the original Hippocratic Oath. There was a phrase in there that is similar to it, but with the translation, it wasn't quite the first do no harm. In fact, it wasn't even the first principle. Hippocrates' first principle was actually to help the patient, and in the event that you can't help the patient, then you do no harm to the patient. So this phrase actually didn't appear until I believe it was around the 19th century, so the 1800s, and it's been attributed to a surgeon named Thomas Inman, who was writing and actually was in a book called Epidemics, Book 1, which was part of the Hippocrates School of Medicine. So he was the first one to actually use the phrase first do no harm. That's often been attributed to Hippocrates in the Hippocratic Oath. So I just found that interesting, so I thought I would share that with you. So ethical theories, let's talk about a couple of the theories. There are a few main ethical theories that apply to healthcare practice. The primary ones are consequentialism and deontology. Now, I said primary ones, I named two, and you see that there are three on your screen. That's because we'll talk about utilitarianism is actually a branch of consequentialism. So the two main categories are consequentialism and deontology. And sometimes consequentialism is referred to as teontology, but we'll keep it this way. So consequentialism is based on moral theories and holds that the consequences of an action form the basis for any moral judgment about that action. So someone who is a consequentialist will find that the best way to move forward resides in what the best outcome or what the best consequences are. In consequentialism, attention is focused on the end product as opposed to the means that are used to achieve that end product. The moral value of an act or a rule or policy is found in its consequences and not the intentions or motives. So, for example, most people would say that lying is wrong, but if lying is necessary to save a person's life, then a consequentialist says that's the right thing to do. It sometimes can be criticized because it can be difficult, sometimes even impossible, to know what the result of an action is going to be ahead of time. We don't know what's going to happen, so we can guess or we can surmise what might happen given a course of action, but you can't say with any certainty what will happen. Utilitarianism, as I said, is a branch of consequentialism, and it's consequentialism together with the identification of the best state of affairs with the state of affairs in which there's the most happiness, the most pleasure, or the maximum satisfaction or desire. So it's really looking at those outcomes, but the outcomes being specific to pleasure, happiness, etc. So the right end to any utilitarian act is looking for the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Okay, sounds good. Sounds plausible on the surface, but in practical terms, it means at times there's a little room for the individual voice. So the individual may not be heard. So it's more of a group consensus kind of theory. And then you also have the problem that the term happiness is open to different interpretations. In utilitarianism, decisions are chosen based on the greatest amount of benefit attained for the greatest number of individuals. So, best bang for your buck kind of theory. In healthcare systems, that means things like resources, energy, money, and time. They're finite and they're to be appropriately accommodated to achieve the best healthcare for society. Okay, also sounds good, but there can be some challenges because, again, like consequentialism, we can never predict the future. So we don't know what will achieve the greatest happiness or the greatest outcome for the greatest number of people. This is the only moral framework that can be applied to justify things like the use of military force or war. You always hear terms like collateral damage. And this is where, this is the theory that applies to that. We say it's, you have to justify that a certain number of people died to prevent more people from dying or prevent other things. So utilitarianism is the one that tends to be used to justify war and military action. Utilitarianism also doesn't really account for values like justice and individual rights. So let me give you, I found a really good example of this. I think it describes it really well. So let's say that you have 4 people who need organ transplants. One needs a heart, one needs lungs, one needs a kidney, one needs a liver, whatever the organs are. And they're all waiting, they're in a hospital waiting, and a healthy person walks into the hospital. Well, a utilitarian view is like, well, we should harvest those organs from that healthy person because we're going to save 4 other people. So, that can be, it's not always appropriate to apply utilitarian theory. Okay. Finally, deontology focuses on the rightness or wrongness of the actions themselves rather than the rightness or wrongness of the consequences. It is duty-based. And this was developed, or became well known by Immanuel Kant, who was an 18th century philosopher. And really, oftentimes you hear deontology referred to as Kantianism. And Kant deemed rules such as do not lie and keep promises, don't kill, on what he believed were rational grounds. So he said, these are the rules, and these are the rules that everybody in society needs to live by. He thought that members of a moral community should take part in developing the rules, but also in living by the rules. So in practical clinical terms and healthcare terms, this means that the moral acts of the healthcare provider need to be judged in terms of the conformity to rules, duties, and obligations. So the healthcare provider applies the same set of rules to every single patient, and there's no room for any varying situations. There can be some challenges there because it can be argued that each patient is unique and it has individual health needs, and you need to be able to apply different rules to different people. The benefit of deontology is it's easy to apply. If it's a rule, you follow it. So unlike consequentialism, which judges the actions by their results, deontology doesn't require weighing the costs and benefits of a situation. It avoids subjectivity and uncertainty because you don't have to follow a set of specific rules. But although it has strengths, rigidly following it can produce results that people might find unacceptable. So let's give you an example for a second. So you have an emergency room doctor, and he's working on a patient who was in a severe car accident. And the doctor worked on this patient for a long period of time and knows that the patient experienced a prolonged and distressing death. And upon leaving the emergency room, he's approached by the mother of the deceased, who tearfully asks whether her son suffered. The doctor responds that he died instantly and he didn't suffer. So from a consequentialist viewpoint, this statement eases the burden of the family during a distressing time. So the lie justifies the end, the means justifies the end. So the end is to, remove some of that family distress. A deontologist viewpoint is going to be that lying is fundamentally wrong and the family is entitled to the truth. So that's kind of a simplistic example comparing the two.